Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gasharu Natural Processed Rwanda from Madcap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Madcap, based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video where it finished second place out of 4 Madcap coffees on that day. We said in that video that this coffee was definitely the biggest wild card on that table, given that this is our first time ever reviewing a natural processed Rwandan coffee on this channel, so I didn't know what to expect from that coffee, and it turned out to be the most vibrant cup of coffee on that table, which is not too surprising given that it was a natural processed coffee, and as a result it earned itself a pretty high placing on that table, finishing second, so it's going to be very interesting to see if it maintained its status as our second favorite of those Madcap coffees. This right here is day 25 of this coffee. And this one, again, brewed through the AeroPress like we have with all the other Madcap coffees that we've reviewed. And the recipe we went with for this coffee in general, though, was our 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I liked this one better through the V60 as well. However, it's coming out really nice through the AeroPress. I feel like the AeroPress works really well for so many of Madcap's coffees. But since it was through the V60, that indicates a more medium fine grind. And kind of the adjusted recipe we have for Madcap, since they don't have a V60 recipe, is a 16.9 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 208 degrees Fahrenheit. And Madcap is a light medium American for the roast profile. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. One more thing actually before that, this one was actually roasted on April 1st and the others were roasted on April 4th. So this one actually is the only coffee that had a different roast dates than the other ones. So when we did that blind taste test, it was actually on day 9, and as a result it was the liveliest cup of coffee on that table on a table full of relatively lively cups. So it stood out on its own for that reason and could definitely feel a lot of strong citrus complemented by an equally strong bit of red berry. So of course I think I commented in that video that I was thinking some sort of pink lemonade, as that was probably the most distinct thing I could pull from this coffee. And as a result, it left a pretty positive first start. I said, hey, this coffee is really lively and it's just unique from the other ones on this table, so pretty positive. Went back day 11 and it was not quite as lively through the Chemex. And I oftentimes say that the Chemex strips away some really positive things. It can also strip away negative things, but in this case, it just diluted the cup in general. Still a fair bit of berries, but not as much of the citric aspect to it, so not quite as good. Very little notes on that. We'll continue. Day 14 adjusted to Madcap's recipe for the V60, and it does feel like quite a different cup of coffee in this sense, as it's still wildly vibrant and tart, but it's even more tart than I think I had experienced from that first try. There's a very strong lemon tart, there's a very strong apple tart, and then there is a bit of sweetness to it as well. I mean, it was a pretty sweet cup of coffee from that first try, and it maintained itself as a pretty sweet cup of coffee with a lot more just tartness, sourness in general. So it was a bit much on this day, and we continued. This time we ran it through the Chemex with that recipe, and it came out a little strange. And I'll be completely honest, I think there was an issue with the water when I was brewing this coffee on this day, because I went back and kind of blind taste tested myself a couple of different waters, because I do have a couple different gallons with a couple of different TDS levels, and this one just seemed off. I think there was something wrong with the water. Regardless, it did impact this coffee in a sense, as much of the berry was diluted yet again in place of the apple-like tartness, but what was really interesting was I was experiencing a pretty strong herbality that was coming from this cup of coffee, and even a little bit of tinniness. Now, in reference to that herbality, I just kind of attributed that to the fact that this is a Rwandan coffee, and they tend to have a lot of those herbal components to them, even if they are kind of overshadowed by some really strong dominant fruit characteristics, especially in this coffee. So it was nowhere near as good. It was a little funky, it was a little different, and I just kind of chalked that one up to the water. With that being said, I definitely experienced a fair bit of herbality regardless of how I was brewing it. Day 19 was kind of getting a better idea of this cup of coffee in general, as it is slightly funky, and that's something I do want to emphasize, is especially through the V60. That's when I experience it the most, is that there's definitely a bit of funkiness to it. So as a result, I describe it oftentimes as a candied apple, because a lot of those kind of hard candy flavored coffees tend to have a little bit of funkiness to it. I'm thinking of a lot of black and white coffees in specific. And super sweet, super tart with a heavy amount of citrus and berries, and the somewhat strange herbality is present yet again. So that's why I said, even though I was having some issues with the water on that day, I don't think it was the water by the end. I think that this coffee is just a little bit herbal, and I think that's because it is a Rwandan coffee. It is in slight contrast to the sweetness, and as a result, you're getting so much from this cup of coffee. But that's been a theme from all of the Madcap coffees that we have reviewed up to this point, is they're definitely not one-dimensional. They're definitely complex. You definitely have a lot of depth to them, and that was no exception with this Rwandan coffee either. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and 2 level 5s, so let's run through those real quick. The finish and the citrus. So obviously a bunch of citric components to it, so I've been mentioning that lemon, of course. And then obviously I have to lump the apple into one of those fruit categories, and it best fits into that citrus category. So I think as a result, the citrus is pretty high. It's not like an overly lemony citrus. As mentioned, there's a lot of lemon to it, but it does have a fair bit of sweetness too. So it's kind of mixed in that sense. But the finish, level 5, it's definitely the most lasting finish of these cups of coffee. I think it's just on that perfect level 5 mark where it is a little lasting, quite a bit lasting, but not to the point where it's overbearing with a lot of the anaerobic coffees. So it's pretty lasting finish in that sense. A bunch of level 4s, actually just a couple, 3. The sweetness, level 4, been mentioning, it's a pretty sweet cup of coffee in general, and it's still probably the sweetest of these 4 coffees that we've reviewed, so that's not too surprising there. And again, the acidity finishing a little higher for Madcap's coffees, which has been another theme. I just don't recall them having been this acidic based off previous experiences. But yeah, it's on the higher side of the acidity. This one's probably the most acidic of those 4 coffees as well. And then the berry fruit, it wavered from time to time. Sometimes I could have put it at a level 3. Oftentimes it was justified at the level 4. Today it is. The day I made this tasting wheel it was, but maybe I'm thinking most notably through the Chemex is when I was experiencing a lot less of those red berries, so it would tone that down based off of brew method. But a couple of other things, bitterness, that's definitely coming from the citrus. I always like to highlight and emphasize that. Florals mentioned, there's a fair bit of herbality, so I think the florals are scoring higher than maybe they've given it credit for when describing this coffee. Body, it's definitely on the lighter side, and savoriness, again, that's kind of that interesting herbality that's coming from this cup of coffee. So it does show that I've been mentioning it, and as a result, it does finish there. But obviously the biggest and most important thing we must discuss is the cleanliness, because this is actually a pretty clean cup of coffee if it's absent of that funkiness. And that's the only reason I couldn't justify the level 4. If I wasn't getting that slight kind of apple candy funkiness, then this one does get a level 4 for me, as I think it's a really clean cup of coffee with that one exception. But then as a result, it ends up at that level 3 mark. So I think that this one on about even footing with the Kenyan coffee. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one ended up being my least favorite of those 4 coffees, and I did have a discussion with somebody that seemed to be having issues with the same coffee because they felt that they were brewing it wrong. And I think when we were kind of comparing our notes, we came to the conclusion that this is just kind of the way that this coffee is. It's a little different, it's a little out there, and I think at the end of the day, the best descriptor I kind of have for this coffee is it does remind me of an apple sour warhead, because it has a lot of those sour, kind of more tart aspects to it, while at the same time it does have a very sweet candy, most notably apple candy-like taste to it. So if you like that, that's kind of interesting, because I think in that sense, at the very least, it was an interesting and complex coffee, even if it ended up being my least favorite of those 4 Madcap coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, well, I think that does lend itself to a very specific person. If you've never had a natural processed Rwanda and you like these very kind of tart flavors, then I think you'll be pretty intrigued by this one, as this one offers that in abundance, as well as a lot of complexity and depth to it just in general. So you can see from the tasting wheel, there were a lot of things that did score, well, relatively moderate or high in this as a result. So this could be a fun cup of coffee if you're willing to kind of step outside of your comfort zone and explore something just a little different in general. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this Rwanda, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gasharu natural processed Rwanda from Madcap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.